Leonardo DiCaprio.
Miss Anne Hathaway.
Meryl Streep, The Iron Lady.
Alan Arkin in Little Miss Sunshine.
Kevin Costner.
The King's Speech.
Birdman.
I'm Connor Rould, and welcome back to another episode of Redoing the Oscars. And here we are talking about the 2007 Oscars, one of the best Oscar years of all time. It was difficult for me to actually figure out what would be my alternative pick, but I ultimately came up with an opportunity that I think is going to be exciting, a kind of alternate history here to talk about what if There Will Be Blood won Best Picture. But if you're new to the series, welcome. We've been doing this now for a few weeks, going all the way back to 2015, every single year, picking a different one of the major Oscar categories and redoing it. Talking about first, who else I would pick in kind of alternative nominated performance or movie. And then we also talk about an alternative unnominated performance or movie. And then trying to figure out the final part of our series here. Did the Academy make the right decision? Some weeks it's yes, some weeks it's no. We try to, obviously we're redoing things to see what would happen differently. But with episodes like this, there is a little bit more of a debate of, did the Academy actually make the right choice? Sometimes the Academy is right. They do recognize some of the best movies of the year. Sometimes they make mistakes, and it's fun to kind of ultimately use this as a thought exercise. But as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below as well. What would you have picked for the 2007 Oscars? In any of the categories, I decided to do Best Picture, but if you wanted to redo Best Supporting Actor or Supporting Actress, that would be fun to see. Now, I think actually this was a really great year for movies in general, and that's what I want to talk about here at the top. We always like to give that kind of a context of where we were for the 2007 Oscars, and I do think this is still considered one of the best years for movies, but also for media too, for music. Video games was also a great year as well, but because we're talking about movies here, it reminds me a lot actually of the 2025 Oscars that we just had, in which the top two movies, One Battle After Another and Sinners, were two really well critically acclaimed movies that made some money at the box office. And once we were in the kind of final thick of things, we ultimately gave it to the older, more successful director in Paul Thomas Anderson, the director who's had multiple movies nominated for Best Picture, who's made, a lot of great movies at this point. I think, over 10. Whereas Ryan Coogler was a younger director. He still had made, not as many movies as Paul Thomas Anderson. He kind of has to wait his turn. So much of the Academy is rewarding the kind of older, celebrated filmmakers rather than the younger ones. And what's so fascinating is that Paul Thomas Anderson in 2025 wins Best Picture when he is the older filmmaker. And then if we come back all the way to 2007, almost 20 years earlier, Paul Thomas Anderson loses Best Picture to the older, more established filmmaker. In the same way Ryan Coogler was on his fourth or fifth movie, this There Will Be Blood was Paul Thomas Anderson's, I think, his fifth movie as well, so they're very similar periods of their career, and yet they went with the older filmmaker in the Coen brothers, who had made more movies that were nominated for Best Picture, and that they kind of had to wait their turn. They didn't win for Fargo. They had to eventually win for No Country for Old Men. And then if you really want to extend this theory, maybe, Zodiac, which wasn't nominated, which is a celebrated movie in 2007, would be Eddington, maybe last year, or, I know that's more of a divisive movie, but I do think that's one of my favorite movies of the year, so I'm showing a little bit of a bias there, but I really do see the 2 years of 2025 and 2007 from an Oscars point of view as similar in terms of two well critically acclaimed movies. There wasn't really a kind of villain of the award season. I think both of those films, and Sinners and One Battle After Another, will be maybe not as well regarded as the two films from 2007, but definitely well regarded. I just think it's so interesting, the parallels of Paul Thomas Anderson not winning in 2007, having to wait almost 20 years for his kind of final reclamation and celebration in One Battle After Another. But speaking now, this is a little bit more of the context of 2007. No Country for Old Men was the kind of think more sophisticated movie at the time, although I don't think that's necessarily the opinion now. It did win a lot of the key awards. It wasn't really much of a race, although There Will Be Blood was the kind of similar Western, also nominated for Best Picture and Best Director, serious kind of a film. But why I wanted to talk about the 2007 Best Picture race was because I liked a lot of the acting winners. I think Daniel Day-Lewis in There Will Be Blood is a fantastic, iconic role for him, as is Javier Bardem in No Country for for Old Men, another iconic role and an actor who has continued to do great work, and I'm glad he has an Oscar. Similarly with Tilda Swinton, I think a lot of people forget that she won an Oscar for this role just because it's kind of more of a traditional corporate thriller. It's not the kind of weirder movies that Swinton is so well known for now. That being said, Tilda's a wonderful actor who is still continuing to be in great movies today. So I'm very glad that she has an Oscar, and I do think her performance in Michael Clayton is very good in a movie I like quite a bit. And then Marion Cotillard, whose win here is kind of an odd one in the sense that La Vie en Rose isn't a super well celebrated movie today, unlike a No Country for Old Men or There Will Be Blood that's constantly rewatched. That being said, I do think Marion Cotillard is an excellent actor who has continued to deliver great performances even past this moment. So I am ultimately glad that she has an Oscar. So why I ultimately went with Best Picture is not because I think There Will Be Blood is a better film than No Country for Old Men, but because of this series as a thought exercise, which is ultimately what this is. I like to give my personal opinions on things of what I would change, but the point of the series is to think about things like, okay, well, what if Paul Thomas Anderson won here? Would The Master, his next film, be more of a big deal? Does that mean if the Coens don't win here, does that mean a movie like A Serious Man doesn't get as well, celebrated? Or, all these different things you'd like to kind of think of. Maybe One Battle After Another doesn't win Best Picture and isn't as celebrated if he had already won and gotten the big kind of roll out for Best Picture and Best Director for There Will Be Blood. Maybe There Will Be Blood in general isn't as well appreciated as a film because it has to constantly defend the fact that it lost out to another well-beloved movie like No Country for Old Men. So going into that now, the reason why I went with There Will Be Blood as my alternative nominated pick, as the title suggests, is because I think that this is a complete achievement of a film. Now, personally, I actually do like No Country better than There Will Be Blood as a personal point of view, but that's because my personal opinions towards films are always about feeling rather than thinking, and I think There Will Be Blood is a thinking movie. I think it's a movie that, through its formal approach, is totally designed to make you think and make you kind of ruminate on its themes. So how does it do that? It does that by having long takes, slow push-ins, and limited editing. The movie is interested in building a tone, in building an atmosphere. It's not necessarily interested in having a very tightly taught, complex mystery story or having a bunch of edits to be entertaining and to keep the story along. It's about sitting in the world. So how do you sit in the world? You have long instances where you don't kind of distract the person or the viewer. When you have an edit that ultimately kind of resets your brain, allows you to blink and allows you to kind of look at something else new. This movie isn't as interested in that. It's interested in the long push-in, the long take, the small, the kind of less edits as possible to really allow us to sit and think in the world. And that's what I think it ultimately does. By having this formal approach of patience, of longevity, it allows you to do two things. First, understand the story more. The story of, I think, dread of a Daniel Plainview character. The will to build something so massive is this kind of hollow, difficult road of pain and anger in the sense of dread that I think the camera is able to bring, that this is a man kind of descending into hell by his own makings and his own despair. But then he also, I think, allows us to think more than you feel, like I mentioned. It allows us to think about the themes of what we're watching, of the interactions between people, because you're not distracted by trying to figure out the story. You're not distracted by trying to reorient your eye, literally, but when you make an edit. You're just trying to think about what the themes are about. And the themes that are in the film are very interesting because there are these larger themes that aren't always discussed in cinema and sometimes are just able to, can't be as described anyways in cinema and have to be done through kind of subtext. And which is why I say this is a movie not necessarily about characters, but about ideas. Because you have a character like Daniel Plainview, who is not necessarily someone who has like a deep backstory or personal feelings, more so than he is just like this competitive vessel of a person who is driven for success. And we don't necessarily even know why he's driven for success, except for the fact that he is. So when he describes himself as an oil man. He's not a businessman that works in the oil industry. He's not someone that just does that for a job. He is an oil man. That is his identity. That's what he does. If Standard Oil were to buy out from underneath him, he wouldn't know what to do with himself. That's the kind of motivating factor we do get within the film. In the same way, Eli Sunday, the kind of opposite here, is about religion and faith, and he's a preacher, and that's his kind of life and what he's devoted himself to. And this movie is ultimately thematically about that kind of clash between these two men, which are representations of these two institutions, of these two systems. I think Sean Fennessy from the Big Picture podcast put it best and most succinctly when he mentioned that the movie is ultimately about the battle for America's soul between capitalism and religion, in which capitalism wins out. It is the kind of materialistic, money-driven institution of oil or money that brings so much wealth to the area, but then that kind of ultimate destruction through these two men and battered nature in which capitalism ultimately wins out over faith. And in particular, I think that this is the turning of the century. It is the modus operandi of the 20th century of how America ultimately became as successful as it is on the biggest stage through kind of the new capitalist system that not other areas of the world really kind of leaned on as heavily. That is represented by Daniel Plainview versus the 19th century view of maybe more religion and the founding of it being a very deeply religious state and the kind of battle for power ultimately that these two men represent. So it's a fascinating movie in that sense of talking about these greater ideas through these kind of two singular characters and their kind of battle throughout this time period. So I like the movie because it is the perfect merge of form and content, because Paul Thomas Anderson was able to figure out what is the best way to tell this story, changed his style from Boogie Nights, in which he was fast edited and more flashy and more interested in the entertainment, and this was more about methodical, about thinking, about entering into this world, and it has a great power to it that is hard to look away, even if it's not necessarily traditionally entertaining. I think I still go with No Country for Old Men in terms of my personal favorite, but There Will Be Blood would definitely have been a deserving winner had it won here with my alternative nominated pick. But now, talking about my alternative unnominated pick, there were a couple different options. I thought about maybe doing 2007, the first Transformers movie, but we talked about Transformers a couple of weeks ago now. I thought about maybe Zodiac. I love that film, but I've actually talked about that movie on this channel before, so I didn't want to rehash things. I thought about, okay, maybe I'll do some comedies again. I love Superbad. I love Hot Rod. But I've done a few comedies. It seems like every week I'm doing my alternative unnominated pick. Ends up being a comedy. I wanted to go away from that. So ultimately decided to talk about a filmmaker that I may only talk about tangentially another time in this series, but actually as a great filmmaker, I wanted to talk about Wes Anderson and his 2007 film, The Darjeeling Limited, a movie that was introduced to me as a kind of lesser Wes Anderson, definitely on the bottom of the totem pole, not necessarily reaching the same heights as a Rushmore or a Royal Tenenbaums. But what's so fascinating to me is when I watched the movie was that I was always really keen to it. I always had a deep connection to it. And through successive rewatches and growing as a film goer and understanding why I kind of resonate with certain things, I think it is not only a movie that I personally have a connection to, of course, but it actually is one of Wes's best films and grows each and every time I watch it. And I do think it's a vastly underrated movie because of that. I think a lot of people aren't willing to actually engage with what it's about because of the kind of weirdness they may feel towards the fact that you have these three white men in India and what could be perceived on the outside as kind of cultural tourism. But I don't think the movie, for what it's worth, is racist at all, and I think actually works well within Wes Anderson's style. Because on a very basic visual standpoint, Wes is one of the best working today and best that have ever been. But when you think about this movie, it's actually different than a lot of his other movies visually, because there's not as many built sets. When you think about Asteroid City, for example, he literally built a town in the middle of the desert, and he controls every aspect, and that's the kind of storybook shoebox-esque kind of dollhouse kind of a point of view that Wes is so able to know so well and is able to control so well and does so well. But then you see this movie and you realize that he's shooting outside a lot. There are these kind of a slow zoom ins. There's a lot more close-ups because we're on a train and we're really tight between all these cramped quarters between the three men. And it's an interesting kind of application of Wes Anderson's ability to essentially not build a set and control it, but to enter into a world and try to manipulate it and put the world through his own eyes. So it still feels like and looks like a Wes Anderson movie, except we're outside, except we're in the middle of busy markets. It's much less controlled than some of his other films, and I think that gives it a unique documentary style for a Wes Anderson film. So just from a visual standpoint, I think it stands out, and it's interesting to see Wes really take his point of view and his look for color and his look for framing, but instead of controlling it completely in an animated film or on a set, he takes it to the real world and comes up with some really interesting, different dynamics that we haven't really seen before from one of his films. But then I think that the topic and the themes of the movies itself are really great because it's got the perfect combination of what I like in Wes Anderson's movies, which is the comedic with the sneaky heart. That there's always a kind of heartfelt moment that sneaks up on you and hits you like a train later on in the film. But because you're having such a good time with the quirky funniness of it, you don't necessarily see it coming, and therefore it hits you even harder. And I think this is a classic example of that, where the first bit of the movie you just have some fun on this adventure with these three brothers and the physical comedy and the fighting between the three of them that is so funny and great. And then you start to realize the fact that this story is perfectly told for Anderson's sensibilities. You have these three men who are kind of distant from each other that are clearly grieving the loss of a patriarch figure in their father, and they don't necessarily know how to grieve or who is going to take the mantle of that kind of a leadership role, and they're kind of fighting for it in this kind of an awkward, funny way in which some of the characters are wearing, the belt or the sunglasses. Some of them are trying to take control by making an itinerary and leading things. Some are just trying to observe, and you see the kind of interesting dynamics between kind of these siblings. But I also think is a movie about grief and about this kind of hole in your life that maybe an important figure would leave, and how the siblings are trying to pick up the pieces and fill in the gaps of what is a distant relationship that the three of them have, and maybe that they had even with their own father, and they're trying to understand that grief and work through it in a foreign area, which is why I think actually the foreign nature of the film makes so much sense, because they have to be distant, they have to be removed. When you have a story about characters who are removed from each other, who are removed from the realities of the situation, it helps that they have deadpan dialogue and are in a place that's foreign to them, because they don't really know where they're going. They don't necessarily have a tense emotional connection to the surroundings of what's around them. They're kind of in their own bubble. And the fact that they are so distinct from the world around them makes sense, because they're kind of removed from their own life. They're kind of emotionally removed from their own life. So it makes sense why they be even physically removed and different from the other people in the areas that they're actually physically in. So Wes, who's so great at that kind of emotional detachment, that unsureness, I think beautifully marriages the kind of fact that you have these men in a foreign land that they're not necessarily aware of. He manages to actually, I think, establish this unique sibling dynamic, which allows for a lot of comedic moments and physical humor, but also allows for some deeper conversations about grief, about leadership, about who wears the pants in the relationship, and how they're able to pick up the pieces and let go of that trauma, let go of that baggage, that luggage, which is so great at that final shot of the film of their father and what he represents, and actually be able to move forward within their lives. So it's a fascinating character study about family, which is what Wes Anderson's best known for. So it's totally similar to The Royal Tenenbaums, and I actually like it similarly to something like The Royal Tenenbaums, because if The Royal Tenenbaums is about control and order in this visual style, while still being about a dysfunctional family, this is about more of a documentary style of adapting a visual style to a place that's also kind of out of control and dysfunctional itself. It's almost as if, let's say, The Royal Tenenbaums, the visual control of things contrasts with the dysfunction of the family, whereas the Darjeeling Limited, you have the fact that you have a kind of somewhat dysfunctional camera that applies very well and mirrors the dysfunction that we're seeing on screen in a way that I don't think other Wes Anderson movies really have. So to end things off, did the Academy make the right choice? I'm going to go with yes. I do think No Country for Old Men is a great opportunity, a great movie. I think the fact that when you look at the history of things, which is what we try to do, Paul Thomas Anderson did ultimately get his Best Picture, Best Director kind of a sweep in one battle after another. A movie that I like better than There Will Be Blood, so I'm happy with it there. And then if you think, okay, let's go with Paul Thomas Anderson, let's give them the win for There Will Be Blood. Well, do the Coen brothers end up getting an Oscar? You know, are they going to win for True Grit or Inside Llewyn Davis? Or where is their moment going to be? Or do they never get an Oscar? So in a way, I look at this and I go, I'm glad that Paul Thomas Anderson had to wait because he still got one at the end of the day. And this way we can get Coen brothers an Oscar, guarantee him there for one in 2007 for a great film, a movie that I personally like a little bit better than something like There Will Be Blood, just because it's a little bit more interested, I think, in real people than it is necessarily just ideas. But of course, it's also a thematically rich movie in and of itself, and I have a little bit slight preference towards the Coen brothers as filmmakers generally. But hey, that's just a personal preference on my part. Two excellent films, and like I said, There Will Be Blood or The Darjeeling Limited, I think would have been excellent winners. Stay tuned to next week. We're going to be talking about, of course, the 2006 Oscars. Should be a lot of fun. But until next time, stay tuned.